Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Westcott. I am the head of media entertainment for Deloitte, and I'm the moderator today. We are going to talk a bit about video across platforms today, and really what's happening in the, whether you want to call it OTT, if you want to call it mobile video, if you want to call it TV anywhere. I'm going to start by just asking the panelists here to kind of introduce themselves and give us a little bit of background on kind of why they're here on this panel. I think it's always very fascinating to understand people's angles on this. So I will start with James.
You said James. I'm Jason.
I'm sorry. Sorry, Jason.
Okay, fair enough. Sorry about that.
I did it again. I did it twice today.
I should have just gone with it. All right. My name is Jason Henderson. I actually have two angles here. I am a senior manager in product at Dish Network, focusing on contracts and new relationships. I'm also the host of a popular podcast called Castle Talk, where I interview writers and creators of today's genre worlds. So, thanks.
Nathan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Nathan Guetta. I am the Vice President of Product and Technology at Condé Nast Entertainment. Condé Nast Entertainment is the video arm of Condé Nast. We are a next generation studio. We do pretty every form, from short forms, digital short forms, TV series, and as well as movies.
And Jay?
I come at this from a couple angles. I used to be the head of digital globally for a couple of the majors, Sony and Universal, so I can tell you the dysfunction of the big guys. And I also ran the largest infrastructure company for OTT that designs the actual software that makes all your movies and demand work for all your cable companies, satellite companies, et cetera. So the challenges of rolling out new technology.
Great. Frank?
Frank Sinton, I'm the CEO and founder of Beachfront Media. So we're actually a fully integrated video platform stack, meaning that we do both video distribution and video monetization. We have products in multiple areas, but at the end of the day, what we do is we help get video to the consumer with ads attached.
Great. James?
I'm James Field. I'm the product manager for Cisco's Infinite Video product. Yes, Cisco does do video, not just build the internet. So we also help people monetize, in fact, like Nathan from Condé Nast down there, monetize their content on any device via advertising or in-app purchases, whether that's games platforms, streaming players, or personal devices.
And Fabian?
I'm the director and founder of W12 Studios. We are a digital design agency based in London. We work with a variety of different clients from across Europe and North America on developing next generation TV technology experience, mostly the user experience. So we work with Verizon and Red Bull and Samsung and a whole different array of different players in this field. Great.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And you could hear from the descriptions here, we've got a variety of folks from content to distribution to monetization to infrastructure. So I think we'll get lots of different points of view today. I'll start off just with a couple comments. One of the things I find fascinating about this topic is that over the last few years, we've had multiple platforms that have been put out in public that have created all kinds of consumer take-up around on-demand television. But what I find absolutely fascinating is, based on a lot of the research that we do, that take-up actually started with the younger generation, what a lot of us call millennials, the under 32-year-olds. So some interesting stats today, at least from our research, that group only watches 25% of their content now live as broadcast. I saw another piece of research today that's saying live TV is now the third most watched platform for that same group. They're watching more on Netflix and YouTube. So they're really changing the dynamics of content. But if I also look at all of the over-the-top services today, I think we are at the point where it's no longer cutting edge, it's becoming mainstream, but there's a lot that needs to happen to make it really usable. So I guess my first question I'll toss out to the group is, there's a lot of talk about OTT and TV anywhere and mobile television, but what does it look like when it's done right? What does the future look like when it's really going to be seamless and flawless for the consumer? Jay, let's start with you.
So I'll give hats off to the BBC, where we were one of the people that helped them build it, which is, how do you take your entire history, archives, everything? Now, they have an advantage. They are a government, not a private company. Make it all available on every known platform that consumers want, and have a single sign-on and a single index. The only thing that falls off of that is that over the course of decades, they assign different rights to different programs in different countries to different distributors, which then means you have to then apply geo-filtering to take that seamless, I want to watch Monty Python in Ecuador on my phone, and suddenly realize, well, I can't do it in Ecuador, but I can do it in, Paraguay. So I think that's what a consumer wants, is anytime, any piece of content, anywhere. And the source of the inspiration has already been determined. It's not some algorithm that you pay a lot of money to create. It is your social feed, your social graph pretty much will fill up all your consumable hours with things that you're most likely to want to watch. And then if you seek out beyond that, as we all will say is a pain point, it then becomes in a world of fragmentation, virtually impossible to index and know where is the easiest path, even if you've paid for the legal right to find that piece of content.
No, I think it's a pretty good point to take the iPlayer as an example. One, I think, also great things that the BBC did with the iPlayer is to mandate the user experience to be consistent across many of their devices, and I think that's a second aspect that I do find, as you can hear with my accent, I'm come from Europe, but when I use my TWC set-top box, I'm always scrambling, trying to find the content, trying to have a good discovery experience with all the services that they're providing me. Whereas in the UK, the BBC iPlayer is quite similar on all the set-top boxes that you use, on all the connected TVs that you use, or even on your mobile phone when you download the app. And I think that was, really,
And
a great thing.
one last footnote on that for people that haven't seen what they've done with their content internationally. It's not just one business model. So you can have sell-through within that. So if you want to own it, you can have a rental, you can have ad-supported, you can have limited windowing, you can have buy two, get one free. So all that complexity we've put in, and different marketplaces roll out different pieces of content. So flexibility of how to monetize should always stay with the content owner, but the consumer is expecting choice, and that's the takeaway.
I mean, it's interesting that we talk about the BBC. So prior to W12, I was actually head of user experience at the BBC, designing the iPlayer experience. And I think from a user's perspective, as important as it is that you expect seamless access to content across all devices that are out there, and there will be more and more devices, and there are lots of challenges making that consistent across all the user experience. I think one of the key ingredients that a user experience probably expects, but it's not quite clear, is obviously that consistent graphic vocabulary, that consistent way of the features and functionality, the look and feel, that design language, and obviously, the BBC is a great example of having developed their global experience language, which is that consistent vocabulary that allows them to talk in the same way to their customers, no matter how they access it. And that's quite important. If you access content, if you pause it and continue on another platform, to really have that in place. And for the BBC, because there are a lot of user journeys that go beyond, across their entire content ecosystem, from iPlayer to sport to news and then back. So I think from a user, the easier you make it, the more consistent it is, but also to kind of have that consistent vocabulary in place is quite important.
I should point out, I think you asked, what is it right now that people want out of an OT? Is that a good restatement? That
Yeah, I think it's interesting that all the examples right here are all from the BBC.
Well, I mean, as a Brit, I can speak. I think that's a great example. And, I mean, everyone would like the BBC offering, where essentially it's free, there's no advertising, and you don't even have to subscribe.
No, but there is advertising on the BBC in other markets.
In other markets, but I think from that experience in the
we
UK,
rolled it out globally. But let's talk about,
What I was going to suggest was that right now we live in this odd period where 89% of TV viewers still to this day have an MVPD subscription, but most of them are using at least one over the top. In fact, I think on average, most of them are using at least two other online, OTT services. So right now, if you ask people what do they want out of OTT, it seems that what they want is to try to fill out those things that they perceive that they're not already getting, or to meet those demands in places where they feel like they're not getting it. So right now we're living in a world where they're trying to fill out that basket of entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a non-BBC example.
Let's do that.
I've never actually used the iPlayer, so. But anyways, one of the things that we've been working on that I think is, so looking at like over the next 12 months, what's happening in the OTT space, I think voice search is becoming hugely important. So one of the things that we've been working on is integration into like Siri and Alexa and things like of that nature. So, you know, Amazon and Apple are both going after this really hard, and now Google is too, of course. But I look at my kids, and they're using voice search all the time. They're using Siri all the time to find content, and I think that's, you know, sort of making that more frictionless environment to content like is really, really important, and that's what the younger consumers actually expect. So it's like we'll see a lot more on the voice search, and then probably the next like 3 to 5 years, it's going to become about personalization. So,
Well, let me take-
looking at a screen and something comes on that you enjoy, right?
So the 3 to 5 year, great city to do this in, you're not going to be looking at your windshield for 3 hours a day anymore, okay? The self-driving vehicle or the Uber that you go into, both situations knows the destination of where you told it to go. So you get into Uber and it knows it's 35 minutes to get there. It will know what content you would like and will serve up a 29-minute episode or a 24-minute episode or something that matches that. And most of our white space will be automatically fit either from our social graph or from our subscriptions to match that time frame. So the reason why Apple is getting into the car and the reason why they're getting into VR is for that programming of that space. But it doesn't solve discovery, which is fragmented and the holy grail.
Yeah, I think on that, back to the point there about content discovery, it's going to come down to lots of the metadata. So part of our role, and again at Beachfront, is to get your content found from Siri or Roku search or Alexa search. You've got to have amazing metadata, and in many cases the platforms today don't open up the platforms for deep linking and searching. You have to be blessed by them to have your feed acceptable, and typically they'll cut deals with particular tentpole properties, normally beginning with N, which enable you to click and search. And if you do that on Apple TV, you'll come up with Netflix properties and iTunes properties, but you have to sort of ask Apple if you can also be on that blessed list. The same goes
Dispensation.
With Roku, it's, I think,
but it's there. I mean, it's
top
all
50
capable.
or so.
The technology's there. We can make it happen. Have great metadata. That's going to drive recommendation and search in future. So really make sure you look after the unsexy part of the business, which is the metadata describing your content.
So we've talked a lot just here about the younger generations, right? They're using voice search. We've talked about their attention spans. We know that they're using on demand primarily. Is there an opportunity for new content formats? You know, we've been creating content formats for the half an hour and for the hour broadcast windows forever, and now we're starting to see a lot of new platforms out there.
Absolutely, a lot of
Yep.
portrait formats. Tastemade, one of our customers, is have done some amazing portrait formats where I think for the traditionalist, doing anything that isn't landscape is a bit crazy, but definitely for millennials, the phone's a portrait consumption device, content works in that space. And so I think portrait is one of the new things, and obviously we can walk around here without seeing the VR, AR promise as well.
I think Jerry Seinfeld deserves credit for something that nobody noticed. His Comedian with Cars figured out how to make the perfect structure. So a sitcom is an exact amount of time, exact structure for commercial breaks. If he's in the car with somebody that is just boring, it's a 7-minute episode. If Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks got in the car, that episode could be 4 months long, okay? It's as long as it's entertaining. So in a choose your own experience and you're setting the length of time, it suddenly freed up that one constraint of going into an hour or half-hour block. The other one that is the opposite challenge, if we're going to the over-the-top challenge right now, is for past at least 500 years, everything that you've interacted with has been within a frame. Think of your favorite painting, an ad in a newspaper, a television, a movie. As we get into VR, the frame disappears. So what are the elements that you need for new content and new storytelling in a non-framed environment? Really challenging.
We've been here before, by the way. I mean, when you look back at the beginning of the century, I think that Edge of Night, the soap opera, was 15 minutes long, and typically those shows were 15 minutes long. Peyton Place in the 1950s was a half-hour program, but it was running 3 nights a week. I mean, we used to experiment a great deal until you hit hardcore standardization. you know, and as Jay's talking about, eventually that standardization can go away. This, by the way, this is not the only industry this is happening in, because books for the past 50 years or so have all been a little over 200 pages. A novel is, you know, something like 300 pages or something. But now with ebooks, nobody knows how many pages you're using, so books are becoming the length that they need to be books. You know, so S.E. Hinton's books back in the 50s were often 128 pages, which was a typical form factor. And that fell aside because of just the pressures of the market, but now those market pressures are irrelevant, and so we're back to books or whatever length books are.
Nathan, I know that your organization has created
Yeah.
immense amounts of content.
Yeah, I think we do create 4,000 videos a year last year, so definitely we're creating a lot of content, but most importantly, we are choosing the stories that can be adapted to multiple formats. So we do recuts of our videos for Facebook, for Snapchat. We do have some, you know, special programming for Facebook Live as well as for our Snapchat channels. So it's clear, definitely, you know, if you want to reach the millennials, you really have to adapt the format of the video. You will not be able to survive in the current environment, especially with, you know, the extension of messaging platform with videos that are more than, you know, 15 minutes. Okay.
And is there a path then for content to migrate to more traditional, you know, considered Hollywood-produced content? What's that path look like?
Well, you can't answer that question without the business model half of it. So, biggest announcement today that we can now finally talk about is Snapchat. Snap changed their business model. They're no longer sharing ad revenue. So everyone, they thank you, just as Facebook thanked you. And they're now going to the classic television model, which is, hey, Mr. Producer, we'll only pay you this for your show, and what we make on it's our business. So the challenge is, can you migrate your content with a business model or with an audience, much the way a you know, independent artist does from different revenue streams?
So with all of this going on, and we have, you know, traditional TV, OTT, MCNs were the buzz a couple of years ago. Who do you see as the winners in the short term? Because we're hitting a bit of a maturation point in the cycle. Who do we see emerging?
Dish.
I think it's people who can make that transition from the YouTubes of this world where they've been losing 80% of their revenue. Can they move their network across to their own revenue, to the Snapchat point earlier on? If you can successfully migrate your audience over to new devices where you can retain the lion's share of the revenue and monetize them in a different way whilst keeping them happy, developing new formats and growing, and ignoring the geography, the internet gives you this amazing opportunity to monetize your brand and your content globally, then those are going to be the winners who can successfully reach their fragmented audience around the world and make the most amount of money.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we can see it currently. I mean, if you look at the Netflix, currently, I think today they are the winners. You know, they do control a large part of the catalog. They do produce them by themselves, a lot of the programming which is successful. So for me, at the end of the day, the clear winners in the short term are going to be the distributors and the producers. So you better, you know, have, you know, I think your two feet in this space if you want to be successful today.
And Netflix is the first studio ever to create content based on.
Yeah.
You know, when I ran the big places, it was what sounds like a good idea, and somebody says that's a good idea, and you know, sometimes it is. They know if everybody's watching wrestling movies for 27 minutes, they'll make a 27-minute wrestling movie. If the biggest star-studded thing, no one's watching, they know it. So they can really do, and they're looking at a global audience. That being said, someone will most likely acquire them, and when you go to a movie theater, you don't get to pick what's on the screen. The theater does. When you're sitting in your self-driving car, you may not be allowed to watch content that doesn't come from that platform, just as your cable box is walled off today.
Yeah, and I think the winners, like in terms of right now, who's winning is the platforms, right? So the FANG, as they say, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google, right? So, and I think the people from a content perspective that are winning, they're able to then see, you know, that's probably where 85% of the users are actually using those particular apps, well, and Snapchat too. But if you're able to adapt your content into those platforms in a way that makes sense, so, you know, all the multi-channel MCNs all of a sudden became, what was it called, MPNs, or multi-platform networks. It was all about like leveraging the different platforms and having content that could adapt to those different platforms, so not forcing the same type of content into Snapchat as you would put on Facebook, as you would put on YouTube. So I think the people who are doing a really smart job are realizing that users are using those different platforms for different reasons and adapting their content to that.
Great point.
It's interesting, though, that, oh, I'm sorry, did I interrupt?
Oh, no, no worries. I think the winners are going to be the same winners as before, and so they're going to be the ones who produce great content. But I think what a lot of people don't realize that maybe that's a point of departure, but it's often not enough. Because you need to create a destination around your content, and you need to shift your brand and your whole business model around that. And obviously, previously you lived in the world where it was quite nicely separated, the world of delivery and the world of consumption. Now that it's collapsed, it's challenging, and I think a lot of studios and networks in particular have great content, but they're not really a meaningful destination to the consumer. They know the titles, but they don't know the studios, except for the thing that Netflix has done so well is build a brand for themselves, and they're being recognized for great content. I mean, that's why I think internationally they have such not such an easy time, but that's maybe why they're so successful gaining traction, because they were first with OTT, so they have they educated the masses, and then they produce great content. They have great content, and they have a great marketing strategy. I think that's what they really have, how they build their brand. But at the end of the day, content is still king and will remain so.
Yeah, Vice has done an amazing job. If you want a case history, like a Harvard case history, failed magazine, figured out that there was an audience for their content, played around on length for the longest time. They failed miserably on YouTube for years because everybody told them it has to be 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes. And then they started putting up 20-minute and 40-minute pieces, and bingo. And they made a multi-billion-dollar brand. HBO was never in any of the tiers, so you always knew what you were paying for HBO, so it was easy to pull that away. And, you know, ESPN, it's now turning out in surveys that a lot of people have been paying for it for years that aren't sports enthusiasts. So coming up with the right model for that, because the holy grail, no matter what any of us create right now for monetization, is live sports. It's sucking all the ad dollars because it's the only thing that aggregates an audience at real time.
And there are new entrants into that area. And last week we launched Flow Sports, who are an independent sports producer. They do about 80 different live events a week. They're going direct to consumer, $20 a month, $150 a year.
Esports.
And it's esports is another example. So, but these are sports like Greco-Roman wrestling, things that ESPN is just never going to put on the main screen. Right. But there are passionate people out there who are interested in those platforms, and it's very realistic for them. And live sports is one of the key parts of entertainment today, which makes money today, even for the old guys. It's live sports, exclusive content.
Bring back the lumberjack games. Remember in the early days of cable, that was always running, those guys that could do that.
Getting back to Netflix for a second, though, if you think about it, Netflix's original concept was we're going to be the library of everything, every conceivable thing when it was discs, every conceivable thing that exists you'll be able to get from us. And now they've moved more towards an extremely personalized but much smaller library available, mostly streaming, and of course they're now known for this original content, which is probably the big differentiator. If somebody wants to see Luke Cage on Netflix, well, so if you're with Time Warner, and somebody mentioned earlier that Warner launched its own over-the-top services, which is Warner Archive. I love the stuff on Warner Archive, but it's interesting. It's very strange to try to figure out why do we credit Netflix with creating all of this original content, but somehow we don't credit Warner the same way with having all of its own exclusive content? And in fact, people may not even be able to reach that content because they don't want to necessarily subscribe to Warner Archive. I don't know. It's many. Go ahead.
Netflix was forced to create content is the way that I look at it. It wasn't a choice. They would have loved not to. But when you wake up one day and you're now writing a $6 billion check with zero differentiation, you say, if I throw enough crap against the wall, I ought to be able to get something.
Well, you mentioned data. I sorry to, but somebody earlier said the most beautiful thing. Like the best thing I heard today was that data ends up being the great differentiator. That a couple of executives sitting around a room going, I don't know if that sounds like a good idea, but if the data says, hey, this documentary about kids who were trying to go pro at basketball is going to do really well, so then the data will say, go ahead and do it, which was not always the case. So now, different voices, more diverse voices can get heard because the data gives people the confidence to go ahead and greenlight something.
Yeah. Something that we do see, that we're doing every day at Condé is experiencing with different lines of content. And of course, getting the data back, but what we do see is, sometimes ideas that could be backed by data are not really working, and sometimes ideas that are coming just from a pure creative sense are working, and this is where we can invest. So we do a lot of one-offs type of videos, and when it works, we create franchises. I think one of the best example I can give you is one of our series on Google Autocomplete that we do with Wired, where we take one celebrity and we just reveal the autocompletion. We saw that it was a big hit with one of the celebrities, so we decided to produce more and more of those. And we didn't, it came, only from, some ideas from some, creative executives. Never, it was backed up by data. And I totally understand the fact, and we all, I think, are working with a lot of data around us, but we shouldn't forget that creativity is the most important thing. Creativity and storytelling at the end, what will bring people to watch your content.
If it was easy, every studio would have every movie be a hit. I've sat on that side, and it's very freeing when you're no longer there. But I've sat where we've all loved a script. I mean, it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I'm not one of these elite guys, but there was one book where I sat and said, "Oh my God, this cannot fail," which I should never say. Career ender, by the way. And then you see the wackadoodle thing that somebody had to greenlight because they had a prior relationship with the talent, and you got to let it go. And then you go, and so there is an art meets science here. The difference is those that are winning right now have hired data scientists. Fundamental shift in how we're looking at this as a marketplace.
So let's just take a turn here. We've talked a lot about content and the platforms. Let's talk about the monetization strategies. And in this space, there's a lot of talk that I get interviewed a lot around cord cutting and skinny bundles. How do you think the market's valuing this industry, and what are the assumptions correct or incorrect today for the distributors?
Who wants to touch the third rail?
The assumptions. I mean, that's a very
Well,
open.
I think it's interesting. I don't know if that answers your questions, but we discussed a lot at some point the pain points that the consumer has and lack of choice and unbundling and going more a la carte. And I think we're seeing that becoming a reality and more going direct and sort of lower price points and more flexibility. But it creates another problem, which is now as choice becomes the management and the choice that the consumer faces as a result of having more things to pick from and to put together creates another problem, and maybe the sum of all of it may not be such a big saving compared to where it was beforehand. So I think it will be really, really interesting to see how that's all going to unfold, whether, it's people who want whether premium is going to stay for sort of a more simple integrated service versus sort of a more disaggregated a la carte service, which might feel less premium because it will, no matter how good the data is, because nothing is open, everything is closed, will always mean there's going to be a lot of burden on the audience side to actually make sense of all of this.
Yeah, I think we've seen the gold rush into the OTT platforms. There's probably not a brand who hasn't launched some of their own form, but what we see is that consumers, exactly as you're saying, are trying to reassemble the experience they used to have, which is I want all the content.
Right.
What do you think? Will there be emergence of new aggregators, more larger aggregators again? Are we going to?
I mean, well, we're still here.
I mean, the aggregators are still there. To the FANG we spoke of earlier on, it's that billing relationship with the consumer. That's part of the other side. You get the sticker shock if suddenly, I mean, most of us say my cable guy is.
Or your Verizon's buying content.
Exactly.
The
People
dumb
are buying
pipes
these.
want to be smart pipes.
They need to buy new rights packages. What we're seeing in many places, certainly as you look to monetize across multiple devices, do these companies actually have the rights for those devices? And if you have to ask, I know we have a lawyer on the panel, if you have to ask, you don't have the rights. So it's pretty key. But we also see the traditional operators, where they're allowed to, with their content agreements, offering skinny bundles. So as people cut the cord or shave the cord, they say, actually, I'll just pay per day, pay per weekend, and get their live sports in that manner. And that's just not happening right now. And you've got to have a really robust control of your rights and your audience to be brave enough to go in that direction. But it's going to happen in some areas. We're seeing it being chewed away at the edges right now.
So we're primarily focused on the advertising market. So I mean, and there's a lot of interesting things going on right now. So to the extent that monetization happens with advertising, that's great. But now you're having ad blocking coming up, and consumers are getting used to. I think I was just on a panel. Someone was talking about the number one reason that ad blocking has taken off over the last year, it's because consumers actually found out there was ad blocking. So they just went and installed ad blockers, right? So, so what happens then if publishers are losing about 30% of their revenues now because of ad blocking? So how do you then monetize, right? So we've been talking a lot about possibly doing some sort of value exchange with the consumer on subscription. So how do you do that in a very frictionless way? Well, guess what? Facebook and Google probably have ways of doing that where it's very frictionless, and people with content will have to adapt to that type of environment where you're relying on Facebook and Google basically to help you monetize your content. But I think at the end of the day, advertising will survive, much to the dismay of my children who can't stand watching ads. But it will survive because it has to, in order for content to be made available to the largest audience possible. Advertising base is still the way to go.
There was an article today in Broadcasting and Cable that was just about, they were talking to different families that were experimenting with cord cutting, experimenting with setting up their own home service, and it was going into just the barrier to entry that we have right now. I mean, how difficult it actually is, and where I'm going to get rid of my subscription, but then I need to get I need some kind of over-the-top. I need various services. I need to find maybe a DVR if I want DVR, because that doesn't happen naturally. I need an OTA tuner. I need an antenna on top of my roof, unless you're lucky. And once and whereas a good old-fashioned American MVPD actually buys that hardware and then leases to you through the genius of monthly fees, and what they found was a lot of people looked at all of that and said, this is too hard for me right now. That right now, that barrier is pretty big. Now, does that mean that somebody won't invent a service that provides all those things? Although in the end, they'll be reinventing MVPDs. That could happen.
But I think I'm not a huge believer in cord cutting, but it's cord nevers that I think the cable companies should be afraid about, because if you're graduating from college, you have to make decisions about your budgets. Are you going to pay like $80 or $100 for cable? They're not.
So we've got 20 million households. So let me frame the conversation from the way that nobody talks, which is from the corporation standpoint. So there's no such thing as cord cutting. It doesn't exist. It's a complete misnomer, and I'll fight anybody tooth and nail.
No, you're good.
85% of America only has one choice for broadband to their home. So they're not cutting that cord. Okay? They're not giving up on the internet. Now, the person that has that cord into your home also offers a cable package of all this content that people are creating. That people are shaving, getting rid of. Some will never sign up and can't afford, but every college kid still needs broadband access. So what's happening in the corporate suite is it's a lot of work to negotiate all those deals and lay out all those capital for Olympics 30 years in the future and a sports team that may or not be popular in the future. When, if you can just have that monopoly, you can raise those rates. So what's happening is the investment in content and the sharing of those fees is going to be the tipping point, in my opinion, to reduce the number of channels that are in those packages.
And we're going to see new technologies like 5G coming in, which offers the promise of a new way to the home. To your point about there's only one provider, the monopoly.
And Facebook has drones that'll fly at low altitude to bring broadband, and there's spectrum battles going on of who's buying this spectrum that we're going to need for augmented reality and VR.
And we also
out
see
there.
MVPDs investing in North America as well in their own they're buying programming, they're buying studios,
absolutely.
they're buying production, because then they still have that unique content. It is all about the content.
Well, we take cord cutters and cord nevers very seriously, because if they're not going to be buying our satellite stream, our typical satellite service, then we've worked really hard to provide alternatives. So Sling TV is there for those people, because we assume that those people are still going to want TV. They just didn't
And
want this
Sling's
model.
had a great year.
It's been doing really well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to continue on this, I mean, we touched on original programming. And original programming we've seen has been a catapult for a few folks. There's been folks who actually have then also discovered how hard it is to create compelling content. Is original programming going to continue to be the key, or is it around other innovations?
You know, can I throw something out? Did I jump on somebody?
No, go ahead.
So I was I'm fascinated by this Warner thing because it just is a perfect example of, like, Walmart just announced it has its OTT service, which is Vudu now has a regular service of TV, of free stuff. But Warner has all of this content. Now, none of it's new, right? They don't have to spend money to actually introduce it. But one thing that Warner probably doesn't even know is that back in the 1960s, they had a shared universe on TV. So they had all these TV series that actually crossed over with one another. If they thought of it, they could probably start rebranding all of that stuff and trying to drive people to it at very little cost, because they don't have to reinvent the television shows. They already exist. They could just play up a lot of these things that you can discover just by linking some of this old content that they're sitting on. So, and the same is true for Sony, and the same is true for all these things who have these deep libraries. So I wonder if there's got to be some way of driving people to some of this legacy content in new and interesting ways.
I mean, great content exists, and there's no shortage of great content. I mean, now there's a higher velocity of great content, but at the end of the day, it depends what business you want to be in. So I think obviously Netflix is sort of in between sort of distribution and consumption. So they since they don't own the pipe, they have to lead more towards content. I think there are lots and lots of services that are in the same kind of situation that sort of need to figure out, okay, well, I have a choice. I can either sort of give my content sort of away for free and maybe get a bit of advertising, mostly gets stolen away on YouTube, or I need to move it up and make it a bit more premium so I can go direct and I can charge a subscription fee for it, or I can have the audience in my own ecosystem. If that's the world you live in, then your content needs to meet a minimum mark of exclusivity and quality, so you can actually attract an audience. And we see, companies like Vivo wanting to migrate away from YouTube and creating their own. And they have that premium content. They don't have the brand recognition. So I think that sort of it depends on that. But I think in general, of course, there is no shortage of great content, but I also think from a consumer's point of view, there's no urgency to I think TV has always been great. It continues to be great. It's just a question. There's going to be some winners and some losers.
Opinion, I have a theory, which is that I think we're addicted to new, especially if you're using, a lot of Facebook, of Snapchat. Everything has to be new. I think that's maybe why right now we're into this fashion of original programming. And original programming has to be, as you said, exclusive, but has to feel new, has to initiate conversations that never happened. And I think this is something that we've never seen before. Look, this morning I was reading the yearly REDF, report on video. This is, I think, the first year where 50% of TV shows, broadcasters' TV shows, are going to be canned. They are not going to renew that. It is the highest level of non-renewals of primetime TV shows. If you look at all the other years, you were at what? 20, 30. We're not going to hit between 50 and 60% this year. Why? Because I do think a lot of, new is so important. And if it's not working, you need to move on.
It's also the fragmentation of the audience. So it costs you the same amount to make a good TV and a bad TV show, 1,000 shows. So right now we are in the golden age of television. If anybody thinks it was their childhood, you're wrong. There's more money being spent, there's more quality programming, and not to whine with the first world problem, but if you're voted on the Emmys, you had 400 plus original primetime series this year, okay? Scripted series. It was a lot of content, most of which does not make any ROI for the creators of that content. They're struggling to differentiate, to build that audience, to have that premium pay up channel. And to your point, the life expectancy of reruns or this or that, we'll binge watch a series once we've heard through our social graph that there's value to it. But everybody's trying to find what's the least amount of content that you have to create to keep that OTT subscription. So HBO pretty much has it down to a science. Okay, I love Westworld. I'll just stick with it till. Oh, now Game of Thrones is coming back. Oh, now
But that again comes down to the recommendation engine. They get you on the tentpole content. They get you in the front door, and then you can monetize the back catalog and you can recommend it because it may not be new to your eye, but a millennial will say, "Wow, I've never heard of that show."
But the broadcast
But
guys.
I really agree on your point of HBO. I mean, it's not TV, it's HBO.
Right, but
it comes back to
so
that,
the
it comes
problem
back
for
to
the
the
broadcast guys is they still have this paradigm that they have to fill up.
Yeah.
Hours and hours and hours, and there's no audience. When you look at, and this is, getting into gray area in the public. But we made all the software for all the cable boxes, so I know exactly what the ratings are compared to what Nielsen says.
Remember 10 years ago, though, when scripted shows were dead? It was like, it's all reality now. We're never writing scripted shows again. All those writers can just go to Boca because they're not needed here anymore.
Well, reality is still the cheapest way to fill up if
For
you
sure.
have to fill up 80 hours.
Oh, yeah,
okay?
for sure, for sure.
I want to watch people look to buy a second home in Botswana because the first home, with a former chef and a boy band. Don't steal that. That's my idea.
That's but yeah, that was gonna happen. It's amazing to me. But yeah, what happened was all these people who needed to create original content to drive subscribers really stepped up their game. That's where your golden age comes from. Is pressure, is that people are like, we can't deal with this. Now a typical sitcom is unlikely to be a good old-fashioned 3-camera sitcom, to the point where that's now a novelty and you can sell it as a novel.
But there's a great one starting in January called One Day at a Time.
Well, let's take on that, because you mentioned the massive amount of content and a massive amount of new content was out there. Talk about discovery. Discovery is a big challenge these days. Back again, 20 years ago, if you wanted to promote a new television show, you bought ad space at Thursday at 8:30, or you knew how to get your content discovered. How do you do it today, especially for the millennials?
One of the biggest challenges of some of the early pioneers that went into OTT and they left, such as World Wrestling, is they forgot the value of all the free promo time that they were getting from the cable providers when they were pay-per-view on cable. And when they lost that, it took them a long time to figure out that new channel, because you have to buy hearts and minds. So if you're a new Amazon Prime series, where do you get your promotional from? These are huge, costly issues. So it's really interesting to see, YouTube taking out billboards.
Yeah. How do you find out, audience? How do you do you find out about new shows from, where? Where do you find if you find out, if tomorrow you learn there's a new show, where did you most likely learn that from?
Or how did you find out?
Billboards or bus stations.
Word of mouth? Does that,
Really word of mouth
Facebook word of
or
mouth?
Facebook
Just to
feed?
understand.
Yeah, we have, OTT customers as well, as they use, social is a really big point to target their audience. It's often niche programming.
Yeah.
They know exactly where their audience is. They know they're on social. They just can target them. They can pay for highly targeted advertising and pull them in. And so that what they want to see is the direct correlation between their media spend and their viewing and conversion rates, which is
I'll tell you
data
that
problem.
Instagram's creating more beauty and fashion brands than any other medium. And huge dollar volume brands. The next Bobby Brown is going to come from Instagram, not from Macy's.
The thing
floor.
that bugs me so much, because is that if you have a particular interest, it's so difficult to find. If I know there's a title I want, I don't know, Robin Hood starring Patrick Bergen, Irish actor, right? Robin Hood starring Patrick Bergen came out the same year as the Kevin Costner one, but it was better. But nobody saw it. So let's say that I'm doing a paper and I want to watch that movie. Where the hell do I find Robin Hood starring Patrick Bergen?
BitTorrent.
If I go to if I go to Roku, just to play out this particular in just a few seconds, if I go to Roku and I enter in Robin Hood, I get 1,000 results. Which Robin Hood do I want? Maybe they got metadata attached, says 1990, whatever it was. So I go, okay, that one. It might give me 0 results because it might not be any of the 50 APIs that Roku will automatically search, as opposed to the thousands of channels that they actually offer. It might actually turn out on a bizarre, tiny offshoot OTT channel on Roku that for some reason doesn't have metadata that's standardized for the Roku result. And so basically what happens, I go back to asking a friend to pirate it for me because I cannot find a legitimate way to find something that somebody has already paid for and wants to give me.
One point back to that is sometimes I'm a little bit surprised that Amazon hasn't done more with IMDb. They have all the metadata on all the movies you can imagine.
Yeah.
And you know what? When I use Amazon Video, I don't really see, the link between, all these magnificent database that they do have and their own services. I'm sure those guys are working on it, but it's true that would serve, I would say, your pain point.
Well, I'm a Roku user, so I would like it. For me, I'd be satisfied if just all of those APIs were standardized so that Roku gave me a search across thousands of boxes.
Well, they are, but it comes down to the game publisher or the app publisher to give that feed and for the owner of the data to make that available. So it's
I mean, I think
It's all
the elephant in the room is, we haven't talked about that Apple TV's never successfully launched because they've tried to get data from everybody
Yeah.
to have the best consumer experience.
Right.
And everybody realizes that they could be giving away their future of having a relationship to the consumer.
Sure.
So there are people keeping your metadata from you.
Well, because any of those search results also, to be fair to me, the viewer, should also tell me if it's going to be coming up just live on TV sometime in the next week. But that means that the search is going to have to do a deal with Tribune, or to get all those DMS IDs and Grace Note.
all very possible.
So one of the things on Discovery, one of the things that we have looked at is as soon as you put a piece of content out there, the word of mouth starts happening, right? It starts being shared. People are talking about it. That metadata around the social graph, around what people are saying about content, is actually really valuable, and it helps with discovery going forward. So as all that video is able to be aggregated, you can then use that data and then be able to recommend additional pieces of content based off of the data that you and your friends were sharing and talking about, right? So I think it comes down to, discovery comes down to data, and I guess I'll use the buzzword machine learning, right? So as you get more and more data about your interests, we're all sharing data with Facebook, with Twitter, with Snapchat about what our interests are. Even Instagram, if you like something, then you must be interested in that. So all of this is being aggregated. All this data is being aggregated, and the discovery problem is going to become a personalization feature, basically, going forward. So.
We start talking about personalization, though, we get into some security and privacy questions. How much are consumers willing to give from their social feeds and interact to get those recommendations? Is that really where the future goes?
Millennials give everything,
Lots.
right? So.
I think on this topic, people don't seem to have any filters outside of porn, of sharing all the thing. Where I think it will suddenly change for even millennials is when it's all tied to geo-positioning. So us in the car, I would love nothing more than I'm being driven my self-driving motorhome through the boring South Dakota to have North by Northwest come on and end right when I'm at Mount Rushmore.
Sure.
That's the fantasy experience. That's when kids would want to watch it, whatever. I don't want to, necessarily be bombarded with, 500 Sears ads because I'm going to be passing Sears in, the next 2 miles.
Yeah.
And so it's going to get into that, and, somebody's got to figure out that balance very quickly.
I mean, one of my suppositions is that as we start seeing just connected cars, even before autonomous cars, the connected car, the ability to step in there and whatever device that, if it's an autonomous car, it's not your vehicle, that you're wearing is identifying you to that vehicle and delivering that content and that advertising.
Well, Uber now will know your Spotify or Pandora channel, and you get in the Uber and your music's playing,
Wonderful.
which I find very soothing.
We kept mentioning piracy, by the way. That's the beautiful thing to me about Spotify. If you're an artist, there are all kinds of problems with Spotify. In many ways, people feel that it's unfair. But the beautiful thing is it cut piracy drastically. Because,
So slavery is the solution for piracy?
we can philosophize a lot about,
Don't be a
but-
wage slave.
But before, in the Napster era, all these people, my age, just sort of sucked down just gigabytes of music. And you can actually see this crater of music sales where people of a certain age don't subscribe to anything and also haven't bought music in 20 years because they stole everything that existed back, in the 1990s. But now with Spotify existing, it's a pain in the ass to steal music now. Compared with how easy it is to just give this guy $7 a month or $10 a month or whatever it is, and I just have everything. That's amazing. I mean, that really makes me feel good about commerce. That it actually just cratered piracy that way.
So why don't we switch to audience development in the OTT space? The millennials, the research that we do say that at this point, social media actually has more influence on millennials than television ads, than any other form of advertising. Scary enough, actually, internet celebrities have as much influence, and that's one that scares me a little bit. It's become an extremely strong channel for influencing folks. But how do we develop audiences using this today, and what works, and what are some of the bright spots we're seeing today?
Do we have anybody young on this side? Is
I think it comes back to that. As we were saying, I think when you want to develop your audience, is what you find kind of a beginning of an audience. You have to understand it, and you have to understand it where they are. So depending on where they are, you have to really adapt the content and the way you format it, so that you can develop, really grow your audience. I totally see at Condé how we are, for example, working on our YouTube channels completely differently to what we're doing on our own and operated sites, so that because we know that the audience is going to be different, and we know that we really have to have different type of content living there. So I think when it comes to audience development, you do see more and more segmentation in the way you have to do it, which I don't think anybody here would have predicted that. I would say 2 or 3 years ago, I think we would only think of a piece of content as something unique, and well, definitely not anymore if you are at least in a distributed model.
Are millennials going to become more? Here's a question that I really want to know the answer to. With the oldest millennials now 32 years old, what I'm curious about is how much of what we're looking at is an illusion of a young generation. If some of the effects we're looking at are just an illusion of what happens when a generation is young. In other words, I remember when Gen Xers had no money because they just got out of college, and so they were all living together and economizing and riding bikes. And then eventually they get jobs and suddenly they look like everybody else.
So I can give you some stats on that. So it is not just here's another generation. So one of the wealthiest real estate developers in LA noticed women were freezing their eggs about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And what he read from that was women were delaying having children,
Yeah.
which means you're delaying moving to the suburbs, so you're delaying home ownership. So you fast forward today, that getting that mortgage is not an inevitability. It's
Right.
not a goal. Owning a car isn't a goal, okay? So a lot of these things, and driving that is student debt, credit card debt, and wages stagnation for the past 20 years.
Right.
So you can look at seismic shifts, and then you bring that back to what can they afford and how can they consume, and what does that thing. So it's it's also the largest generation that we've ever seen.
Yeah.
2.3 billion in one generation, which is more people than were on the planet when my parents were born. So it is a fundamental change. Where they get knocked in the stereotypes of this and that is youth that we all had not fully formed frontal lobes in making decisions. But one of the upsides that, again, I've studied this a lot. I was CEO of a company that had an app with 150 million monthly millennials using it. They travel more than senior citizens and retired people. So they value experience over possession, and that goes back to the stealing of music era.
Right.
If you know that you can always get access to something, you don't need to own it.
Right.
So if you believe it's in the cloud, why own it when you could have this once-in-a-lifetime experience? So it's a shift then to what content we create and how we figure out advertising. They're not against advertising, by the way. They love advertising that is relevant. So again, willing to share personal data. I've seen an awful lot of tampon ads in my life, and I've yet to become a customer. Thank you for the petty laugh. But millennials will not be experiencing that. The ads will be custom tailored because it is not.
Although
a
as of
mass market.
2016, they still are. I mean, if I'm watching on Roku, I see this. You're totally right.
It depends where.
Totally right. But we still have.
But they're consuming a ton of their thing on YouTube. We've already said that.
Yeah.
That's completely specific.
Oh yeah.
They're
Yeah.
doing on Facebook, Facebook Live, Facebook 360, big investment, completely specific.
But do you really think so? I'm actually intrigued and pleased by the data that you're citing about the question of owning a car, like for instance, owning a car, getting a mortgage. But I've often wondered about that. Do we? if we look at Uber and Zipcar and car sharing and all this stuff, is it because they don't want a car ever, or because they can't afford a car, or they think they will never afford a car? And
No,
they do things where they,
it's not a desire. It even goes beyond that. Rent the runway. You know, why spend the investment for a designer dress and then be forced to wear it the next 6 parties and be known as the girl in the pink dress with the
Sure.
with the blue dots? Whereas you could have a different designer dress each time and have that experience.
Yeah.
So rent the dress, own the room. That's their slogan. And you're seeing all of this, the actuality.
It's the unstuffication.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, if you're just looking at TV viewership when it comes to those from 18 to 32, I mean the decline is huge. You said it in beginning of the panel, but I think it's a 60% decline in TV viewership for those ages. So it's happening, and it is a seismic change. It's not something that is going to go away. We will have to live with it, and we'll have to adapt our content to it. And
So
the way that-
we've been measuring content consumption of the millennials for 10 years. And I think I mentioned as we were preparing for this, I was lucky enough to walk in and take over this job when my predecessor in 2005 said something's happening. What we found is every trend in media consumption has actually started with the millennials and then moved up,
Yeah.
with the exception of one, which is tablet ownership. Why? Because a tablet was $500 when it came out.
Right.
So they all got the tablets the same way my children did. Is I bought the first one, handed it down, bought the next one.
Right.
But that's the only trend in the last 10, 11 years that we've seen in media consumption that actually didn't start with the millennials. And they're actually the ones that dragged us, I'm looking across here, the older guys in the room here, dragged us to social media. They dragged us to SVOD. The very first time I got Netflix was because my teenage daughter asked for it. So it's those types of things. They're the ones that drag us to it. I would like to open up and see if there's any questions from the audience. We do have a few minutes. Yes, sir.
Hi, this is something that Jay had mentioned earlier in regards to, well, the panel said content is king. And you mentioned that the business model really drives that. My point is, when you look at Warner Brothers, they own an amazing IP called Young Justice. It had
Yeah.
the book, it was a great.
Sorry, very enthusiastic.
And yet, the business model said they're not selling enough
Toys.
toys to boys. So they said, let's cut the series, great IP, great everything, the numbers. However, the data they didn't interpret the data, said we can't sell the boys, but boys and girls are watching, which was a new thing. Why not sell, quote, dolls to girls? They missed the point. So to me, there was a business model that says no matter how successful this thing is, it's not helping us sell this thing called choice, which is why we allow the IP to transfer into the media. So with that said, will content win over a business model?
No. And unequivocally, 1960s, Fred and Wilma Flintstone on Hanna-Barbera were going to have a child, a son. Yeah, a son. No, what happened was the toy companies, the advertisers came to them and said, wait a second, we'll sell a lot more if they have a daughter.
Wow.
And that changed. So we're all in the content business. Business will always trump. Now, they may make the wrong decision. I mean, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 20 years sold an awful lot of toys. A lot of things. Transformers sold a ton. It was the #1 toy 2 Christmases in a row, something very unusual to do. So you have to come up with it. Disney has a wonderful 10-year cycle on cars. You know, Star Wars was bought for a reason. These things make it.
But what happened with Young Justice was a travesty. It was a travesty because they had like 3 female leads on that show and 3 male leads, roughly.
Large female audience of consumers.
Yeah. And for some reason, all they had to do was just think, we can expand merchandising and market towards women who make up 52% of the population and watch television. And we're already watching that show. And for some reason, it wasn't somebody's job to think of that. And so it was canceled.
Well, people make mistakes. I mean, there's not a person here that wouldn't say Breaking Bad wasn't one of the greatest series ever created.
It's a good one.
And when they came out with their toys and action figures and Meth Lab, they got vilified, okay? Wait, we laugh, but I grew up, playing cowboys and Indians and shooting guns at each other. I mean, you can look at anything out of a cultural context.
Sure.
But no, obviously you don't want your kid with the meth lab.
I want Mad Men action figures. I think that would be awesome.
But so not everything, there's an art and a science to getting some of the stuff right, and sometimes it misses.
But it could come back because of data. Because now there's all of these people who are excited about Young Justice and are and we're in this weird model now where the companies will order 12 episodes and then it goes away and then people write in and they go, hey, let's do another 12 more like 5 years later. So it can very well come back.
Yes, ma'am.
So in terms of data, I mean, I come from a tech background in data, and I also write and contribute to different press. And one of the things that I've seen in data is that they don't really take into account not just their lifestyle, but like it seems to point to generalization versus, like you were saying, personalized, or we assume these things. Because one of the things that I've been studying is that, like life cycles, when you harvest your egg, eventually in your 30s and 40s, you're going to have children. But, there are other parameters or points in life that can change your taste and your personality, your economics, and also your financial. So when I see those pivots within data, I'll share a good example. I went to Mattel and they did the Barbie, and Barbie was going down like 20-30%. It was hitting rock bottom. Globally, they didn't know how to enter new markets, or they saw so much noise within the internet space that they had to really not just take a look at influencers, but people who were really talking but not buying and influencing the purchaser. So for instance, they had a lot of Reddit guys, total guys and geeks that have nothing to do with family or have children, or were willing to take into account for the sake of that particular demographics, because now the new mothers were subconscious about buying a Barbie doll for their own children because of what it represented. So now they have a diversity and inclusion lab, and they went through, now they have tall, skinny, petite, and curvy Barbie now, in different sizes, different hairstyles, different shades, and now they have, you'll like this one, they have crime fighter Barbie.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now that's really jumped up within the sales. So I think it's also missing a point on where the noise is coming from that influence. So when you guys are doing original content or distribution, are you guys really looking at other noises that impact that data, or that data interpretation and perspective?
I would say, yeah, I mean, we definitely look, at, comments. I mean, of course, we are looking at, views, where do they come from, referrals, social comments, number of shares. We do look at all those, at those elements. But one thing I was thinking when you were telling me that is, I think as an industry, we've been maybe a little bit late versus the advertisers. And especially if you look at the technology that we do use in advertising, and versus what we do use in content, it's true that I think as an industry we're a little bit late. The good news, especially if you're Condé Nast, is we live from advertising, so it's quite easy to connect to our data management platform and get back this data and put it back into the mix. But I tend to agree. I mean, we're, as an industry, I think we're a little, especially as a content creative industry, we're late. We're a little bit late on that.
It's also a cultural issue. When you come in with a bunch of data scientists and go into the creative writer's room and say, we really need the superhero to be blonde next week and to carry a baby girl, they're not always receptive. So.
Creative.
Yes, sir.
Hi, so what do you guys think is like the next storytelling shift? Because you guys mentioned of like changing formats and changing times, and it's thinking of like, well, is there a thing like a cold open anymore, or something like now that YouTube videos and Facebook videos are like 90 seconds or 3 minutes, and so just kind of see like where do you think like as far as storytelling goes, at least in the visual medium, where is that shift going to be, or where do you guys see, or if there's any trend of it that you guys are seeing?
Great question. Cold Open is one of the subjects that I think we all have in mind, especially after the different Facebook announcement going to a mid-roll format in their live format. We are thinking, okay, if they were to move that to VOD, how would it look like? So definitely, right now there is a big question in terms of the cold opens and who would you write them in your creative process. The second, I would say, big thing in terms of format, at least for us this year, is VR. We are launching on the 27th of October a new series called Invisibles that a great producer has worked on, which is Doug Liman, the producer of the Bourne series or Mr. and Mrs. Smith. So we're going to see, we got a sponsorship from it. So Lexus is going to be our sponsor on this series, and we're going to see. I think it's a very, very, experimental time for VR right now, and especially when you are coming to the market with a sponsor on the full TV series, on the full series. So, yeah, I mean, there is a lot right now going on those two. I would say on those two tracks. I would say those are the ones that we're scratching our heads up the most.
Yes, sir. Last question.
I'd be interested in your views in terms of the platform capabilities. As we're talking about multiple platforms here, you have some platforms that require specific use of native applications in order to have a more flexible environment, constantly changing issues. So how do you find the ecosystem? Is it being dumbed down to the least capable platform? Are you only working towards the most popular platforms to advance them?
Goes back to the business. It goes back to the business model, right? So you will always work on where you have the most eyeballs. So for us, it's mainly web and mobile web. So this is where we're investing the most of our time right now.
You have two diametrically opposed constraints. One is to have the greatest consumer experience, you have to be able to control that consumer experience. So every channel on your set-top box works the same way. You take it for granted, but that's pretty cool. It could be Hearst content, it could be Condé Nast content, it could be the Super Bowl. You can pause, fast, it all works the same. On the other one, you want to have open, unlimited breadth, the walled garden versus the open internet. And, Apple and iTunes, got very big with one approach. And then you lay the money across that decision matrix, and that's what's driving it. So if you don't control the platform, then your only choice is the only way you can get a fragmented audience worth monetizing is to slice and dice it in as many places as you can. Yeah. And if you own the platform, then you can make exquisite content. Think of a PlayStation or an Xbox video game that will only play on your platform, but the experience is worth having the platform.
But you don't have all
And VR is at that, who will control that in the consumer space? That is the discussion taking place everywhere on consumer-facing VR right now.
Well, I think from a consumer point of view, there's no question about it. You need to be ubiquitous on all platforms and seamlessly present. I think it's a question about, from a content provider point of view, what you can afford and where you want to position your brand, because it does get quite expensive. And there's a lot of efficiency you can gain by having sort of the right kind of technology and the right kind of vocabulary in place so you can be effectively and efficiently quickly across all the platforms. But you have to be on all platforms. I think and you have to have a strategy in place of graceful degradation so you know where your hero platform is and where are the ones you just need to support. But if you're not present on all platforms, I think nowadays you will lose a big chunk of your audience, and then you're better off migrating your content onto another platform that is omnipresent and that can fulfill those user expectations.
And I 100% agree with that. I would do, because that's what I do. But if we looked at a straw poll along here, who's got an Apple TV in their home? Who's got a Fire TV? Who's got a Roku? So if you want to hit us all, right, you have to be on all these platforms. There's no choice. So fear of missing out is something that we can remove, and I think.
Yeah, I think being on all platforms is important, but I think if you're going to concentrate on one, just think about the mobile phone as the first platform, because at the end of the day, I think the average consumer opens their phone and looks at it 150 times a day. So if you really want to like, think about that, right, like that's actually like probably the first place you should start in terms of platforms, and then go from there. And it's not just short form; it's you know, long form as well, medium form, all kinds of content being consumed on the mobile device. So I would say, like, you know, if you're looking at mobile first, you're probably also looking at Instagram, Snapchat, and Facebook, because those are the apps that are the most commonly used on the mobile platform, and then kind of go from there. So.
Will you please join me in thanking the panel? Thank you very much, gentlemen.